Hey everyone, settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift back together. If you're listening to this in bed, perfect. That's exactly where you should be. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. We're going to take our time, meandering through a corner of Roman history that is rarely explored, and perhaps for good reason. Because tonight we're asking, what actually happened to the children born to gladiators in ancient Rome? It's not the kind of bedtime question most people ponder, but that's what makes it perfect. Strange, oddly specific, and just unsettling enough to keep your mind interested while your eyelids slowly start giving up the fight. So, gladiators, the ancient world's most famous celebrities, and at the same time, its most disposable humans. They were adored by the crowds, worshipped almost like rock stars, and yet, legally speaking, most of them were little more than property. And like all human beings, adored or enslaved, they sometimes had children. But what became of those children? Did they inherit their father's doomed career in the arena? Were they celebrated as the offspring of a hero, or despised as the child of a slave? Did they even survive long enough for anyone to notice? The answers are complicated, and naturally a little disappointing, because that's history for you. Let's begin by reminding ourselves of what a gladiator's life looked like. The movies love to show a rugged hero with bulging muscles, defying emperors and winking at women in the stands. But the reality was usually much less glamorous. Most gladiators were enslaved men, prisoners of war, criminals sentenced to the games, and some were even volunteers, Romans who signed away their freedom in exchange for food, a roof, and the chance at fame. The ancient world's version of quitting your office job to become an influencer. Now, because gladiators lived in these strange halfway worlds, half celebrity, half slave, the question of children becomes even stranger. On one hand, Roman society adored the idea of virility and strength. A famous gladiator might have attracted plenty of attention from women, sometimes noble women, who sneaked them into their beds the way modern aristocrats sneak into nightclubs. On the other hand, legally, gladiators were considered infames, people stripped of basic rights. They weren't really supposed to marry. They weren't supposed to have families. But of course, they did anyway. Because human beings don't particularly care what Roman lawyers say. Let's drift over to the first scenario. Imagine a gladiator who manages to father a child with a woman who is enslaved in the same ludus, the gladiatorial school. In that case, the child was, tragically, considered property, born into slavery. No matter how strong his father was, the baby would inherit the mother's legal status. That meant a future of serving, cleaning, or, if the child was unlucky and grew into a sturdy boy, possibly being trained for the arena himself. There are hints in Roman legal texts that some gladiatorial trainers kept the children of slaves around the schools, raising them almost like farm stock. The next generation of fighters. Imagine being 6 years old, and your playground is literally an arena where your father might be bleeding into the sand. Sleep tight. But not all gladiatorial children were born into slavery. Some gladiators had affairs with free women. And this is where things get bureaucratically messy. Technically, if the father was a slave or infamous, his child did not automatically inherit his disgrace. The child's status usually followed the mother's. So, if a free-born Roman woman fell in love with a gladiator against every piece of social advice available and had his child, then yes, the child was legally free. But socially, oh dear, that child would grow up being whispered about. Because Romans loved gossip almost as much as they loved bathhouses. And the gossip would go something like, "That boy, his father was a gladiator." Yes, one of those sweaty men who got beaten up for fun. Imagine. So, while the law might have allowed the child to live free, society might never let him forget his father's profession. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of being the kid whose dad was a professional clown. Nobody really lets you live it down. Now, here's where we need to pause and appreciate the irony of Roman hypocrisy. Because while respectable Roman senators would sneer at gladiators and their offspring, those same senators would be the ones bribing guards to spend the night with a particularly handsome gladiator, or paying fortunes for gladiator sweat in tiny perfume jars. Yes, that was a real thing. Roman women bought little vials of gladiator sweat, believing it had magical aphrodisiac powers. Naturally, it did not. So, in the daylight, gladiators were despised. At night, they were desired. And their children, those poor children, were caught in between. Another possible path for a gladiator's child was adoption. This wasn't common, but it happened. Sometimes, a freeborn woman who secretly had a gladiator's child would adopt the baby into her family as if the father had never existed. A convenient little rewrite of history. After all, Roman record-keeping was not exactly airtight. Birth certificates were not a thing. And people lied all the time about their ancestry, especially when it made life easier. This means some gladiators' children may have quietly melted into Roman society, grew up, took jobs, even became soldiers or merchants. Nobody the wiser. Their father's blood soaked into the sand long ago, and the child lived on, anonymous. But let's not romanticize it too much. There's every chance that many gladiator children were abandoned. Infanticide was distressingly normal in Rome. If a baby was considered inconvenient, whether because of poverty, shame, or just bad timing, it could be left outside the city gates, exposed to die or be picked up by someone else. The child of a gladiator might have been considered doubly inconvenient. Too much shame for the mother. Too little value for society. Some of those children, left on the hillsides, were rescued and raised as slaves in other households. Others were not rescued at all, and just like that, a human life disappeared. Another footnote lost in the sand. So, to summarize this drowsy little dilemma, what happened to the children of gladiators? Some became slaves, some were quietly free, some were adopted into normal families, and many, tragically, were discarded before their lives could even begin. The one thing they rarely did was grow up to be famous gladiators themselves. The idea of dynasties of gladiators, like family careers, is mostly a Hollywood fantasy. Gladiators died too young, and their children, if they survived, usually found other paths. But still, it's oddly comforting to imagine that somewhere in the crowds of the Colosseum, watching the games, there may have been young men and women who were secretly the children of the fighters in the sand, watching their fathers risk everything for one more cheer, one more fleeting moment of Roman glory, and then slipping back into anonymity. Let's drift onward, because gladiators weren't the only people in history with unfortunate offspring. If we stay very quiet and very patient, we can tiptoe into the candlelit halls of medieval Europe, where royals, in their silk and their powdered faces, were busy producing some of the most fragile, sickly, and frankly baffling dynasties you could imagine. And naturally, we'll start with inbreeding. Hey everyone, still with me? Good. If not, If you've already drifted off somewhere between gladiator sweat perfumes and Roman abandonment policies, then all the better. But for those still awake, let's glide forward, quietly, into a softer and silkier piece of history. Because tonight we're not looking at kings. Kings get enough attention. Too much, frankly. Always strutting around in the spotlight, remembered for their battles and their beheadings. But behind every king, or rather beside him, was usually a wife, or two, or four, sometimes six if the divorce lawyers were particularly busy, and most of these women are forgotten. History remembers a few: Cleopatra, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Catherine the Great, the ones with flair, the headline acts. But for every powerful queen, there were dozens of royal wives whose names barely survived a few paragraphs in dusty chronicles. And yet, their lives were every bit as strange, tragic, and occasionally ridiculous as the men they were married to. So, who were they? And more importantly, what became of them once the wedding was over and the king lost interest? Let's start gently with Joan of England, also known as Joan of the Tower. Born in 1321, the daughter of King Edward II and Queen Isabella. That's already a difficult start, having Isabella of France as your mother, also known as the She-Wolf of France, who famously helped depose her own husband. Family dinners were probably awkward. Joan was married off at just 7 years old, 7, to David II of Scotland, who was about the same age. The marriage was supposed to bring peace between England and Scotland. Spoiler alert, it did not. Because peace treaties in medieval Europe worked about as well as New Year's resolutions. So little Joan grew up in Scotland, more pawn than princess. Her husband David would eventually become King of Scots, spend years in exile, years in captivity, and mostly years making poor decisions. And Joan? She faded into the background. She bore no children, which in medieval queen terms was basically the only job description. She was politely ignored by her husband, overshadowed by political chaos, and eventually died at the age of 41. No great legacy, no statues, just forgotten. Her gravestone, if you're curious, is gone, lost to time, which feels like the perfect metaphor for her life. Now, let's glide over to Spain, because the Spanish royal families of the late Middle Ages were, how do we put this kindly, genetically complicated. The Habsburg dynasty in particular was so devoted to marrying cousins that by the 1600s, some of their kings looked like experimental cabbage breeds. But tucked among all these powerful men were their wives, who did the hard work of marrying into doomed family trees. Take, for example, Maria Ana of Spain, who married her double cousin Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Ana is remembered mostly for producing a staggering number of children, 16 pregnancies to be exact. Not all of them survived, but enough of them lived to keep the dynasty limping along. Her personal achievements? None noted. Her opinions? Not recorded. Her individuality? Quietly erased under titles like consort, mother, and pious. And when she died in 1646, at the age of just 39, exhausted by childbirth, the chronicles gave her a polite nod and moved on. Her husband Ferdinand, by the way, remarried immediately, because of course he did. One of my favorite forgotten wives is Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess who married King Charles II of England in 1662. Now, Charles II is remembered as the Merry Monarch, which is a polite way of saying he drank too much, partied too much, and slept with, well, essentially everyone in England who wasn't nailed down. Poor Catherine arrived in England, young and hopeful, bringing with her a dowry that included trading rights to Bombay and Tangier. So yes, She basically handed England the keys to part of its future empire. And what did she get in return? A husband who paraded his mistresses through court like a fashion show. Catherine struggled to fit in. She never bore children, which again was a major royal sin. She was mocked for her Catholic faith, accused of plotting assassinations, and at one point nearly sent back to Portugal in disgrace. And yet, she endured. She lived through the scandals, survived the plague, survived the Great Fire of London, and outlived her husband. She eventually returned to Portugal, where she spent her last years quietly, finally free of the endless humiliation of being Mrs. Charles II. History rarely remembers Catherine, except as a footnote. But she's the reason the English still drink tea. She introduced it to the court, and from there it became a national obsession. So the next time you see a cup of English breakfast tea, thank the forgotten queen who endured decades of public humiliation so you could sip in peace. And then, of course, there are the wives who never even made it past the wedding. Take Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of Henry VIII. You know Henry, serial husband, enthusiastic beheader, England's favorite example of what happens when a man has too much power and not enough hobbies. Anne was married to Henry for all of 6 months. He found her unattractive, famously calling her a Flanders mare. Charming, he divorced her almost immediately. But here's the interesting twist. Anne might be the luckiest of all his wives, because instead of being executed like Anne Boleyn or abandoned like Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves was given a generous settlement, several houses, and the title of the king's beloved sister. She lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life, outlasting Henry himself. She even became friendly with his children. So while the history books often paint her as a failed queen, she was actually the only one who got out of that marriage with her head, her fortune, and her dignity intact. The pattern you might notice here is that most of these women were forgotten not because they did nothing, but because history never bothered to write down what they did. Chroniclers focused on the kings, the battles, the politics, the scandals, a queen who quietly endured, who tried to hold her household together, who raised children or kept the peace, wasn't considered worth recording, and so their names faded. But maybe that's the gentlest kind of legacy. While kings strutted across history like overconfident peacocks, their wives often survived in silence. Some lived long after their husbands were gone, managing estates, guiding children, or quietly sipping tea in Lisbon. They were forgotten by historians, but they might have been remembered fondly by the people who actually knew them, which, in the end, is perhaps more comforting than a statue. So what became of the forgotten wives of famous kings? Most of them lived lives of quiet disappointment. Some were discarded. Some were humiliated. A few turned their circumstances into survival, even comfort, and nearly all of them were erased from the spotlight. But tonight, drifting here together in the quiet, we've lit a little candle for them, just enough light to remember that they were there, that they mattered, that they were more than just the queen who couldn't produce an heir. And with that, let's let them rest again, because there's another question waiting for us, somewhere deeper in the night. What did medieval peasants actually do all day? Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. You're now far more dedicated than most medieval peasants ever were to their landlords. If you're drifting in and out, that's also fine. Because tonight, we're not talking about kings or gladiators or forgotten queens. We're sinking down into the muddy, bread-flavored reality of the medieval peasant. the kind of person history usually ignores, except when they riot, starve, or supply comic relief in Monty Python sketches. But they were the majority, the backbone of the entire system. Without them, the castles would have had no food, the knights no horses, the monks no beer. And yet, what we usually imagine when we think medieval peasant is a kind of eternal misery. Waking up before dawn, plowing the fields until your spine resembled a question mark, then collapsing in the mud with nothing but turnip soup for dinner. Which raises the very modern question: did they ever get a day off? Or was it just work, work, plague, work, death? The answer might surprise you, because strangely enough, medieval peasants may have had more official days off than the average modern worker. Let's set the scene. It's the 13th century. You're a peasant in England. You live in a thatched hut with a dirt floor and maybe a pig snoring in the corner. Your life revolves around farming, because agriculture isn't just your job, it's survival. If the harvest fails, you starve. If you don't show up to work, your landlord notices. And medieval landlords were not known for their forgiving HR policies. So yes, you worked hard. Very hard. Long hours in the fields, especially during planting and harvest. But here's the twist. Medieval society was absolutely obsessed with feast days, saints' days, holy days, random religious excuses to down tools and head to the village church. And there were a lot of them. Depending on the time and place, peasants in Europe might have had between 80 and 120 days off a year for festivals, feasts, and holy observances. That's right, up to a third of the calendar. Far more than your average modern American with their stingy 2 weeks of paid vacation. Now, before you get too jealous, let's add some realism. These days off were not exactly beach holidays. A feast day might mean trudging to church for hours, sitting through long services in Latin you couldn't understand, then standing around watching the local lord and clergy eat roasted goose while you had barley bread. But still, you weren't in the fields. That counts. And sometimes, feast days did mean fun. Village festivals, games, dancing, maybe even a bit of drunkenness if the ale supply hadn't run dry. The church calendar provided peasants with structure, variety, and just enough joy to make life tolerable. Let's drift a little deeper into the rhythm of peasant life. A typical day in summer might begin at dawn, with the rooster serving as your unwanted alarm clock. You'd head out to the fields, perhaps with a wooden plow dragged by oxen. Your tools were crude, your clothes were rough, and your diet was largely bread. Bread with onions. Bread with a little cheese if you were lucky. Bread dipped in thin ale, because the water was not particularly trustworthy. But the thing is, your day wasn't necessarily 12 solid hours of misery. Medieval work was often task-based rather than hour-based. You did the jobs required, plowing, weeding, harvesting, and then, sometimes, you stopped. There were seasonal lulls in agricultural life. Winter, for example, was a slower season. You might mend tools, patch roofs, or gossip around the fire while you tried not to freeze. But it wasn't endless back-breaking labor every single day. And Sundays? Always off. The church made sure of that. Of course, not all peasants were equal. A free peasant, yes, those existed, might have had more control over their schedule. They rented land, paid dues, but weren't directly bound to a lord. A serf, on the other hand, was basically property. Bound to the land, forced to do corvée labor for the lord's demesne, the lord's personal fields. If the lord said dig, you dug. If the lord said harvest, you harvested. If the lord said Come build me a new fish pond. You did it. And if you didn't, fines, beatings, or worse. So your days off depended heavily on your legal status. But even serfs, ironically, sometimes benefited from the sheer number of religious holidays cluttering the medieval calendar. If St. Whoever's Day fell on a Thursday, too bad. No harvesting today, my lord. God said no. Let's add in a little dry humor here, because it's irresistible. One of the most common complaints from medieval lords was that peasants had too many days off. Too many feast days, too many festivals, too much loafing around pretending to be pious. Imagine being a medieval peasant, standing in church, barely awake, thinking, well, at least I don't have to hoe turnips today, while your lord fumes about lost productivity. So yes, peasants had days off, but mostly thanks to the church, not because medieval society cared about their well-being. Now, what did peasants actually do on those days off? Some were solemn, prayers, processions, fasting. Others were rowdy. May Day festivals, for example, could get delightfully chaotic. Dancing around poles, drinking too much ale, crowning a May Queen, sneaking off into the woods for activities not strictly sanctioned by the local priest. There were also tournaments and fairs, though peasants weren't usually the stars of the show. Still, they could watch knights hit each other with sticks, buy trinkets, or just stare in wonder at things they could never afford. And let's not forget, holidays were prime marriage days. If you wanted to find a spouse, you went to a festival, because nothing says romance like meeting someone while you're both clutching stale bread and watching a man juggle geese. It's worth pointing out, though, that medieval life was not cozy or easy. Days off didn't mean rest in the modern sense. Your body was worn down. Your teeth were probably terrible. Illness was constant. Life expectancy was low. And when famine or plague struck, all those feast days didn't matter much. But it's a strangely comforting thought, isn't it? That even in the Middle Ages, peasants carved out moments of joy, ritual, and togetherness. They weren't machines endlessly grinding away at work. They celebrated, they rested, they laughed, drank, and occasionally threw rotten vegetables at their betters. So the answer, in the sleepiest summary possible, yes. Medieval peasants did get days off. Quite a few, actually. They just didn't involve hammocks, cocktails, or flights to Barcelona. And with that, let's let the peasants drift back into the fields, where they belong. Their feast days are over for now. And yours, well, yours might just be beginning. Because the night isn't done with us yet. Next, let's wander into something darker. What really happened to the bodies of executed criminals in history?